Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 14 cheat sheet. If you haven't watched the cheat sheet series already, it's a series where I rank all the positions in FPL, looking at all the players that you have and how efficient, in my opinion, they are for the next coming fixtures. Not only the short term in terms of the next 1 to 3 fixtures, but really also looking and forecasting to the medium to long term. How good is an asset to hold? How good is an asset to buy now, looking to the future, considering underlying stats, considering what managers say, and injury updates and things like that. So that's what we're going to be looking at today with the cheat sheet. As far as key updates, of course, I think the big one really is that the Jota injury seems to be sort of quite pronounced. We also have an Ansu Fati injury as well, but Brighton's fixtures aren't particularly good, so I think we'll be more interested in the Liverpool ones. There's also been news on Alisson, for example. He's going to be out, but actually for shorter than we expected. Initially, it was reported around 5 weeks. That seems to probably be a little bit of an overestimate, right? And I think Alisson will probably come back sooner, which means that there is a very, very small Kelleher punt that you can tap into, I think, if you jump on this week. But if you don't, then it might not be worthwhile. As far as the people who have been supporting the channel, thank you guys so much lately for your support. The channel has grown tremendously since the start of the season, but I would love to push the channel towards 20,000 subscribers towards the end of the year. That's the goal that we've set. Hopefully we can meet that sort of target as the fixtures come fast in FPL over the next 2 to 3 game weeks. And for all the members as well who have been financially supporting the channel, thank you guys so much. But let's move on quickly to the midfielders. As far as midfielders this week, what we have is a rise for He-Chan. And the context, of course, so far is that someone like Gordon was someone that I dropped recently. And of course, I recognize that there are a lot of players here who've dropped some massive holes who are still, for example, yellow prospects. Gibbs White is a good example. Gordon is a good example, who actually has a fantastic fixture versus Man United. However, my opinion still is that Gordon for me is probably just a tier behind Palmer and He-Chan. I still love my penalty takers. I, as someone who previously owned Gordon, would probably still say that I'd rather own Palmer for this shorter run with Chelsea, starting with Brighton at home. And even, for example, He-Chan starting as soon as next week. For example, if I was investing into some of these players, I like Palmer because Palmer gets to save you a little bit of money, which at this point in FPL is a bit of a godsend, right? If you have a player who can actually give you enough money to improve on some of the tough positions right now, which would be the defender position, in my opinion, where we potentially need to pull more funds because unfortunately, 3 defenders in this fixture period where there are so many tough fixtures back and forth for players doesn't mean that you can really just survive with 3 defenders. In my opinion, you do need to rotate in this period, and that's why, for example, a little bit of money squeezed out of Palmer can be helpful. As far as, let's say, He-Chan, I just think the fact that he got penalties last week is interesting. Now, he got penalties because he drew the penalty. It might be the case in the future, for example, when Mateus Cunha actually gets and earns a penalty himself, that maybe He-Chan won't be able to take that penalty. But we have to take the assumption now that since Hwang scored a penalty, that I think he is the assumed penalty taker, or at least we have a good weightage, right? 75-80%, which is going to be huge in terms of his sort of medium-term value in FPL. Keep in mind, of course, he will be one of those players who will be leaving during the Asian Cup. As far as Gibbs White, he's been added to the cheat sheet. Look, ultimately, the fixture run is still perfect. It's Everton, Fulham, and Wolves back to back. These are great fixtures for Gibbs White. If you do, for example, think that he's very strong, he is a penalty taker as well, who has more creative numbers. So he's less of, for example, someone who's XG dominant compared to He-Chan. So I think there's a big difference there in terms of He-Chan is more of a goal scorer, Gibbs White is more of a creative player. So you might want to also consider that in hand as well. Whereas I think He-Chan is more of a Game Week 15 transfer as well, and Gibbs White is not bad actually in Game Week 14. The reason why I don't really recommend someone like Gordon for now is just simply because right now, Gordon's fixtures probably are best at 17. And I still think that that's the next best time to jump onto Gordon. In the meantime, I think if you can actually afford a little bit of a downgrade in terms of saving yourself a bit of money, I think Palmer can do wonders for a lot of people, for example, who have Haaland teams, who are actually trying to save as much money as possible, right? And for example, if you're a no Hollander, trying to plan ahead of time how to get back into Haaland. And that's why you sort of need to squeeze as much budget as possible in this position, which is the only reason why I think Gordon, because the fixtures aren't perfect for Newcastle, isn't someone that I love. We've seen, of course, that his numbers have been stellar, really, when he's at home. And honestly, that is also reflective of this Newcastle team as well. But given the fact that 3 out of 4 of the next fixtures are also away fixtures, I just think that this is just one of those fixture runs before 17 where I would say Gordon would just be second tier. As far as the Dingra, he also falls. This is part and parcel due to the fixtures for Brighton, as well as a slight decrease in our expectations for them. I've been talking about how initially at the start of the season, we were thinking that Brighton were really one of those elite offenses. And What has actually changed this season, I think, is that Aston Villa have moved far clearer ahead of them, and they're sort of setting that expectation as a team outside of the traditional top four, top six, that have sort of moved into that category where we can generally consider them as a top offensive team, whereas Brighton has taken a few steps back, partly due to injuries and partly due to their inability to, for example, manage, I think, the multitude of competitions right now that they're competing in. So that's why Adingra falls as well, part and parcel due to those fixtures. As far as the 6.x position, I have given Kudus a rise, but I think there is a huge concern, of course, with his injury condition, right? Because obviously in the European game, he was also out of the squad. So we need to sort of see what is going to happen with Kudus for the weekend, whether he's going to be ready to play. Got 2 assists in the previous game and ultimately has nailed down great attacking minutes. I think we were all waiting and seeing when Moyes would actually incorporate him into the team fully as a starter. That has become the case now, so I'm not really worried about his minutes anymore. And that just gives him potential to rise, of course, in the cheat sheet. The question, of course, is going to be how strong or how weak is this West Ham team right now? Because with players like Bowen out, with players like Kudus out, of course, the attacking ceiling of the team is going to drop. So I do think that that's just something to look at. As far as Doku, right now, I think one of the key things to say is that Grealish has brought a level of performance that is incomparable to Doku so far. Doku has been incredible for Man City, and the craziest thing about Doku is previously we would see situations like, for example, in the Manchester derby where you can see Grealish play because, of course, Pep would want to play him in a more pronounced style, in a more controlled style. But I think what Doku has shown so far is that he is sort of continuously improving, and honestly, the ceiling of Doku seems to still be, pretty far out of sight, and that is quite a scary thing. Right now, he's been able to sort of terrorize a lot of defenses, and you can see, for example, in one of these performances like Red Bull Leipzig, where when City are down 2-0, which of course we never really expect to happen, particularly when they're at the Etihad, is that someone like Doku is essential to bring onto the field for City to actually get a result. So he is one of the key attackers right now for this team. And I still think the risk, of course, even at this ridiculously good price point, is he going to get enough minutes, right, over someone like Grealish? And unfortunately, of course, with Grealish fit, I do think Grealish will take minutes here and there. But Doku has been playing so well that I think it's very hard to ignore. It's one of those things where at the start of the season, when some people were a little bit wary, for example, of Alvarez's minutes and his form, that he would continue to keep his spot in the team. I think Doku is one of those players who is starting to sort of eclipse that level where it's so hard to drop him. And Pep is one of those players who will, for example, acquiesce to that, right? He is someone who will understand that Doku is one of the key performers of the team right now, one of the key threats of the team, and potentially this is what City need to, for example, take that step up. But I still think it's worth being a little bit cautious about his minutes. As far as Trossard, it seems like he actually got pretty much rested for the Premier League fixture versus Wolves this weekend, so I definitely think that he's a good differential. Previously, of course, the issue with Trossard, once again, is always how to manage minutes, right? Because what he did play was effectively left center mid in the previous match, and Havertz as well as someone who's actually, done well in the last 2 games, or even 3 games, arguably, for Arsenal. So he's in a good spot right now in his place in the team. That might, for example, squeeze out some minutes from Trossard in left center mid. Then the question, of course, is what to do with Martinelli. Does Martinelli deserve to, for example, start again versus Wolves? Or is the question actually, should Trossard start, and should Jesus continue to keep his spot as a center forward in the team? So I think with Trossard, of course, he's got the positional flexibility of being able to play left center mid, center forward, and left wing. So I like him as a differential for this, but of course you have to realize that it's a huge punt, right? Because unless you're, let's say, planning to do a very short-term wildcard, it's very hard to guess when Trossard will get benched and whether it's at opportune times. The next 2 fixtures for Arsenal are crucial, but let's say if you get Trossard starting versus Aston Villa but not versus Luton, then of course that sort of punt fails. As far as the 7.x position right now, what we have is Mbeumo really as the reigning supreme leader. He has been moved into this price point because of all the price rises that he's gotten recently. Sterling has also been giving a rise. I think part of that is because we're talking about how fixture swings matter, and right here, right now, you've got a good fixture swing here. Being able to target a Brighton team that are completely hamstrung in terms of their defensive players. Dunk suspended for a fixture. Couple of the injuries in this team as well. I just think this is a prime fixture for players like Sterling and Palmer to actually bring into your team, right, if you haven't already brought them already. And ultimately, Sterling has been stellar. Great in terms of set pieces. Of course, we'll still miss your chances. We'll still make mistakes in the box in terms of decision making, but you can't really complain when Sterling is sort of operating at a very, very good level. Right now, the underlying stats are very positive. Of course, it's an improvement from last year. And not only that, but I think there is a genuine thing to say that the Chelsea team itself is stronger from an attacking point of view this year compared to last year. Yes, of course, they haven't gotten the results, but we've seen, for example, the peaks in terms of, for example, what they can bring to the table versus a team like Man City. And I do think that, of course, is going to be huge for Sterling over an easier fixture run. Luis Diaz is also a new addition to the cheat sheet. I think the only concern here, of course, is once again, Jota is injured, right? So our expectation is that Jota is probably going to be out for at least 5 weeks, but which actually doesn't sound like too long, but actually from an FPL point of view is very crucial for this period, right? That could actually last us all the way to game week 20 or further. And that's why I think Luis Diaz is such a good punt. The only concern I have for Luis Diaz is, as you can see in terms of his underlying stats, of course, he is someone who actually is struggling a little bit in terms of, for example, expected goal involvement compared to his peers. So even though he's actually very close to players like Foden and close to players like Sterling, I think the question, of course, is does he have the same minutes as players like Sterling and Foden, even with Jota out? And we have seen, of course, when Liverpool, let's say, have someone like Jota out, that they still will be able to find different variations of play, right? For example, Darwin at times can of course, play almost a left-wing hybrid position. We also have some other players coming off the bench that can actually maybe take some minutes from Luis Diaz, but I think it's rather unlikely. This is the best time really possible to own Luis Diaz, and the question is really just if you have faith in him. I think this is a great time to own him. I would probably still prioritize, for example, Mbumo first, because you can still see the huge gulf in terms of expected goal involvement, but of course you can see that Luis Diaz, Sterling, and Foden, they're all very, very close in terms of that XGI. Definitely worth tapping into this season. And with Foden, another thing I'll say too is he does seem to be someone who right now is operating a little bit better in that sort of 10 position. And we saw a great performance once again with Red Bull Leipzig. The concern, of course, with Foden, of course, is, for example, look at his performance in the Champions League compared to the Premier League. It's not exactly the same. And a good example is, for example, a team like Arsenal absolutely battering a team like PSV, battering a team like Lens at home, of course, in the Champions League. But have they been able to do that actually in the Premier League? And of course, we can't just compare and contrast like that. So that has been the issue with Foden this season. We have seen, for example, a market slight decrease in terms of his expected goal involvement, but he is still operating in the areas that we still like. And I do think, for example, his minutes are still extremely secure. The concern with Foden really is free hit 18. Does, for example, investing into another Man City player sort of block your ability to have a good squad for game week 18? And is that, for example, something that should make you consider, let's say, bypassing Foden, going for Sterling instead, or going for Luis Diaz instead? That might be the case, and that's why I think we need to sort of consider that. As far as Bowen and Martinelli, I think the concern really with Bowen is just the asterisk with Martinelli. You're just looking at a situation where, unfortunately, I think his minutes are slightly at doubt because, of course, Trossard has been incredibly in form as well and can take those minutes at the left wing position. And on top of that, of course, Arsenal's attack, it is completely fair to say that Arsenal's attack have dropped off a little bit. Now, part of that, as Mikel Arteta will often say in press conferences, is because of game state, right? Arsenal were a team last season who were able to take games and leads early. So, as I said, once again, comparing and contrasting to the Champions League, these sort of blowout performances in the first half versus PSV and ultimately versus Lens is something that we haven't seen in the Premier League. Maybe it's the case where Arsenal have been a little bit unfortunate, right, in terms of being able to sort of break apart their opponent or capitalize on a mistake and therefore sort of open the dam with their opponents. But the reality, of course, is the underlying stats for a lot of Arsenal players have struggled. Martinelli is still at a price point where I think he's a little bit too high, and ultimately I think he deserves a drop for that reason, because you can see, of course, the XGI compared to some of the other peers in this category just isn't good enough. And in terms of these sort of premium players here, Saka, Son, Fernandes for me are still the top players. Rashford and Odegaard still out of the question for me. As far as Salah, still the king. Still someone that I would think about moving into. But ultimately, I think the concern really with Salah, of course, is if, let's say, you're someone who's been, for example, moving into a no Haaland structure, I still think that we are moving towards a structure where ultimately, if we're going to pick one of the premiums within the next few weeks, I think by game week 16, that is a good opportunity to jump off of Salah, right, and move and consolidate into a Haaland structure if you're in that position. So I think if you're on that one premium structure, you're probably going to be leaning there, and ultimately you're going to see out the Fulham fixture, you're going to see out the Sheffield fixture, but after that, the question will come, do you go off of Salah? And I do think around game week 16, we'll see him potentially drop on the cheat sheet, but we'll see what happens then. As far as the forward position, moving on to that this week, I think one thing to iterate from the first point of view is that, of course, we have the Ansu Fati injury. And that Ansu Fati injury is very significant because, of course, that should helpfully improve the minutes of João Pedro and Ferguson. The only thing I would say about João Pedro and Ferguson is that this is not the week to transfer them in. Ultimately, it's Chelsea away, still a pretty tough fixture. The team is quite depleted. They're also focusing their efforts on the Europa League too. So for me, the concern with João Pedro and Ferguson is let's see what happens, for example, with the Chelsea fixture. Let's see what happens in the European fixture as well. Then we can reassess on these sorts of players, and then we can also reassess whether whether we want to be investing into, for example, an 8 attacking setup with João Pedro, given that Ansu Fati, someone who's taking a lot of minutes in the forward position and the central positions particularly, is out. The other thing to say in terms of the budget, the sort of forward position is, in my opinion, I think it's not fair to say that there are any green priced assets here. When we compare and contrast this price point compared to the midfield price point, I think the options are incomparable. Edouard is a step below, in my opinion, to someone like Palmer, someone like Hee-chan, or, for example, some of the other penalty takers we have. The only benefit that Edouard really has in the short term is if Eze is out for 3 to 4 weeks, which seems to be the case, he might be on penalties. So that's very, very nice for Edouard. But we do know that this Crystal Palace team is probably going to struggle a little bit from the offensive point of view once again with someone like Eze out, even though, of course, Olise has come back into the team. So that's the only thing I'd say about Edouard. With Wood, I think his minutes are still very, very poor, so I would still class him as a differential. With someone like Cunha, I still don't think he's a transfer this week. Absolutely the case like Hwang, for example, I would actually consider going into Cunha on Game Week 15 if you're really looking for someone in this price point. But once again, realize that I think that a lot of the, for example, price points here do not compare to the midfield in FPL. And Calvert-Lewin falls for a very similar reason, where fixtures are still pretty tough for Everton ultimately. And of course, the minutes are still not perfect for Calvert-Lewin. In the 6.8 position, Solanke for me is one of those options who still sort of differentiates from the rest of the field. When we look at, for example, the fixtures ahead, of course, it doesn't look particularly good, but Aston Villa at home is still a nice fixture. When we know that this Bournemouth team is actually on an upwards trend, and in fact, the upwards trend is on attack. So I think there's less of a concern there. Of course, Solanke blanked in a fixture where they sort of blew apart their game last week, and it's a bit regrettable, right? If you moved into Solanke, such a good fixture, and him blanking. But I still think, for example, when you look at fixtures like Man United, we do need to be looking at them as a green fixture ultimately. They are a team to target 100% on defense. You can see in the Champions League, you can see it in the Premier League, just in terms of the chances they concede. Somehow they keep the clean sheets in the Premier League, but I won't talk about that. I just think that's been fortunate, really, for this United team, who have been really paltry. As far as the 7.x position, you're looking at someone like Darwin, who for me is still, for example, the king of the land. I think Isaac is a good transfer this week if you really want to move into Isaac, but I think the concern is that if you compare and contrast someone like Darwin and Isaac, right, the difference, of course, is first of all penalties, but the second difference is also minutes. And let's say how, for example, minutes can be managed. Newcastle's focuses right now would also be primarily on the Champions League, where Isaac, for example, played the full game versus PSG. When you look at, for example, the Premier League, it might be the case that they tried to give Isaac a little bit more chances to rest. Whereas with Darwin, this is not the case for the Europa League with Liverpool, right? Ultimately, he can be rested in those fixtures, so you have more guarantees for his safety in terms of minutes. And with Jota being out, that of course takes out one other player who's threatening his minutes. The only other player who's threatening his minutes is Gakpo. And so for me, I think that with Darwin actually having such great underlying stats, that still, for example, shows that him and Isaac are great picks. Maybe you could consider that Isaac is green, but I think the concern, of course, is also, what is the situation really with Wilson's injury? Ultimately, I think Isaac's fixtures are also a little bit worse compared to Darwin, which is why I think there's a tier gap, and maybe Isaac will continue to rise, as I said, as we come to Game Week 17, where both Gordon and Isaac can sort of be prone to rising then. As far as Alvarez, I have given him a drop. Personally, I think that it's worth maybe playing Alvarez for Game Week 14 because Tottenham is such a good fixture. But I do think that, for example, the whole idea of, let's say, free hitting on 18, right, to play around Alvarez, to keep him in your team, that opportunity might have come and gone. Now, maybe actually the play is actually to go for Doku instead. And the play could be, for example, Doku, Alvarez, and Haaland, right, as opposed to going for any of the City defenders. It's quite tough for me to sort of justify the landscape right now with Alvarez, with Darwin being so good, with Isaac being so good, and on penalties. So I do think that Alvarez sort of does, for example, have to drop because the options in this position are so strong and competing with him in such a good way. And you can see the underlying stats being a great example of that. Of course, one of the intangibles that he has is that he is a set piece taker. So when we think about, let's say, set pieces, of course, those are low XG or low XA chances, but they usually, of course, have a higher conversion rate if the player is good quality, right? We know that from players like Madison. We know that from players like James Ward-Prowse. So that's the only thing I would really add from Alvarez. But of course, the concern, I think, is that the competing options are still very good. And I do think that now, because we have so much options in terms of Darwin Isaac, there is no need really to sort of stick with Alvarez as that sort of punt to carry you towards free at 18. And that's why he falls. As far as Nkunku and Jesus, we still need to watch what happens in terms of Arsenal in the future. I still think Jesus, completely, doesn't cut it really compared to some of these options in this price point. As far as Nkunku, it's just a wait and see game. I mean, I have him on the cheat sheet. There's an asterisk associated with him because, of course, we need to sort of understand his true fitness. He has not started a game. He was not in the squad versus Newcastle, so it might be the case that he's eased in over the next 3 to 4 fixtures, and by then maybe Chelsea's fixtures aren't so good again. So we need to see what happens with Nkunku, but I think, of course, our expectations for him can radically change as soon as he, for example, becomes completely, let's say, entrenched in that Chelsea team. But we need to see when that happens because we can't justify when that's going to happen. As far as Watkins, I feel like he still deserves a rise, even though he's got City at home and Arsenal at home in the distant future. Why I'm saying that is because with, let's say, comparing players from one season to another, I think Watkins has played enough this season, and this Aston Villa team has shown us enough this season that their attack have completely stepped it up to a new level. The only thing I'd say, of course, that is a huge detriment year on year is that Watkins has lost penalties. But let's be honest as well, he's not a very good penalty taker, and he probably is one of the worst penalty takers we've ever seen. As far as Watkins, though, if you look at the underlying stats, I mean, that jump up is something that is quite astronomical. It's very similar to, for example, the jump up that Isaac has, which is no surprise, of course, because I think Isaac, unfortunately, is a little bit of a victim to small sample size, right? So his underlying stats might be a little bit too high. I like to think that if you watch, for example, at least 12 games of 90 minutes, then that's when you can actually make that sort of judgment call on a player, or maybe around 10 games at least, to say, okay, he's played 900 to 1,000 minutes. This is the good time for us to say, okay, his underlying stats have jumped, or the team has jumped in terms of the attacking quality. This is the case with Watkins, a huge jump up, enough sample size, and I do think that we need to seriously be considering Watkins as a potential season keeper. At the sort of ridiculous price point that we own him at. Now, of course, he's 8.5. I'm not saying that you necessarily need to be keeping Watkins forever, but the reality, of course, is Watkins is still an amazing pick, and there is going to be a little bit of a risk associated to moving towards Darwin, right? Because the minutes, for example, can be bad suddenly, for example, in the Sheffield fixture, which would actually, for example, invalidate the want to move away from someone like Watkins, who's versus Man City and Arsenal back-to-back. But I do think that we have a chance here with Watkins where in Game Week 15, we can probably do a hokey-cokey thing where you go from Watkins to Darwin or Watkins to Isaac, either this week or next week, and you just simply come back to Watkins on Game Week 18. Whether you really want to do that is probably another question, but I do think if your team is, for example, entirely well set up for the fixture run ahead up until 18, generally consider that, because you probably will be able to sort of roll enough free transfers to do that powerful move to go back into Watkins on Game Week 18, and maybe you get to tap into the upside of, let's say, moving into Darwin and Isaac on Game Weeks 15 and 16, even though I recognize, of course, Isaac's fixtures are much worse, right? There are away fixtures and versus some pretty tough opponents, except for Tottenham, of course, from an attacking point of view. As far as, let's say, Haaland, of course, he for me is still the option that I think that we're going to lean towards, right, in terms of that one premium structure. I know a lot of people have gotten and done well without Haaland, but I do think that we are now reapproaching a time where Haaland's a great pick. And if anything, we've been talking about how, we change expectations for certain teams. And the change of expectations for a team like Tottenham is that they truly are pretty horrific from the sort of defensive point of view, and this is a great fixture for me to even consider captaining Haaland over Salah, which also, for example, changes the landscape between how we rate these sort of premiums, and that's simply what it comes down to for me. As far as the defensive position this week, we have a lot of changes here, but I think a lot of the changes are very similar to just the patterns that we've been seeing that have emerged. With Lascelles, once again, the asterisk is just around the Botman condition. We do not have any updates there, but I still think he's a good pick, provided that Botman's going to be out for the future. As far as Gabriel, I think that he should be rotation proof, right? I think he has played well enough for us to say that, and I'm just going to give him a rise on the cheat sheet for this reason. For Tsimikas, I think you're waiting and seeing what is exactly going on with the Europa League fixture, but I think ultimately the 3 run of fixtures here is very good. He played well versus City in the Etihad, so I do think that this is a situation where Tsimikas, his minutes should be relatively secure, and he should give us enough starts here for us to sort of be tempted to punt into him. As far as Livramento, I think he's been brilliant for Newcastle, but still, for example, seeing Lewis Hall come in at times, seeing Livramento play so many minutes in the Champions League still makes me think that he might be prone to some rotation and rest. You need to, for example, manage your young players, and I do think Newcastle do that as well as they can, of course, with this sort of very limited pool of players that they have. So it's a tough situation for Newcastle, and I do think they'll have to rest and rotate him. And of course, as I've been saying, the fixtures aren't perfect for Newcastle. With Pinnock, I think this is once again one of those questions as to whether you want to commit to free at 18, because if, let's say, some of these City options like Alvarez are slowly dropping in appeal, the Brentford options are still fantastic, right? And Mbumo is great. Pinnock is great as well. Luton is one of the best fixtures that you're going to have this week, so I think Pinnock's fantastic. Another thing, and another player that's actually not on this list, is Taylor. I think Taylor absolutely should be played this week. It's Sheffield United at home. You're not going to get a better fixture for Taylor for the rest of the season. So do play Taylor if you have Taylor in your team. But that's all I'll be saying about Taylor. As far as Guecky and Mitchell falls, because I think Crystal Palace's fixtures are getting worse, and also actually their defense might be a little bit more overrated. Now that some teams are actually stronger in defense than Crystal Palace so far, I do think it's worth saying that they are probably one of the teams that are, great in terms of plugging this hole, because look at the fixtures, right? West Ham and Bournemouth are still good, but of course then you've got Liverpool down that calendar, and of course that's going to be a tough fixture. As far as, let's say, Maguire, we've been talking about how this United team have been awful in defense. I think they've been extremely fortunate. The next best fixture, of course, is Bournemouth, and that's probably a great opportunity for us to actually invest into Maguire, but for now I think I've got no interest really in owning Maguire. As far as Castagna, he falls as well. Ultimately, he was a great option to sort of plug in a hole versus Fulham versus Wolves, and he wasn't really able to deliver. Robinson, of course, got an assist instead, but I still think Castagna is great for game week 18. But he is just, for example, one of those options that you plug into the back of your bench. He's called upon on game week 18, might be called upon on 15 or 16 as well, and simply that. When the tough fixtures are bad, I don't think you can trust Fulham at all. When the fixtures are good, that's when you can call on. And that's why Castagna, for example, is still on the list, but still is a differential. And I think he falls because Fulham, their defensive quality is still really, really, really poor. Looking at, for example, someone like Tim Ream, the mistakes that he made, I think they're a little bit inexcusable. And we'll see, of course, what happens if whether Tosin Adarabioyo comes back into the team and actually strengthens the back line. But those are my thoughts on Fulham right now. Konsa, just a pure backup option, only really good for game week 18. In terms of the 5.x position, I think Zinchenko here has to deserve a mention. He's been someone that I've been mentioning is a very, 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 very high-risk player in FPL. And the same goes for Tomiyasu as well. The same goes for White. I think right now, when you're looking at the fixtures and you're wanting to invest into an Arsenal fixture, the reality is you want whoever you're going into to play the next two games. Now, the fact that Tomiyasu and Zinchenko got rested at 45 minutes in the Champions League is very, very good for Zinchenko's minutes. And I do think that it's worth taking a small punt. If Zinchenko is someone who you think can plug in a hole for game weeks 14 and 15, where a lot of fixtures are pretty poor for some players, right? For example, you can't play Porto in game week 14 and those sorts of things. For example, game week 15, you can't play Aston Villa defender. That's when you need a player like Zinchenko to come in, paper that sort of plug and plug that gap for you, and then maybe you can move on to another player in game week 16, someone like James, for example, when he's back from suspension, or another player like, let's say, Walker, for example. So I think that's what I have to say about Zinchenko as a differential. As far as the sort of Liverpool players and Trippier, I still think that they're not the cream of the crop. I still think, for example, if you're moving towards a Salah Holland structure, if you're moving back into a Holland structure, that's still, for example, you losing money, right? Because from Salah to Holland, that's still a jump of 1 million. You're trying to cut down on budget as much as possible. It's so hard to justify moving into Trent. However, I think Trent's probably the only player I would move into if you're, let's say, tempted to go without Holland up until game week 16 or up until AFCON, then I think that Trent, for example, is one of those differentials that you want to move into. His underlying stats have actually shot up recently, and that probably suggests, of course, that maybe slight change in structure, change in fixtures as well. And also, one thing that we'll have to talk about, sample size. Trippier's sample size has dropped a bit. This is what we expected. Tougher fixtures for Newcastle mean it's tougher for Trippier to break through and sort of create so many chances versus teams. But you can see, of course, still even versus PSG, man of the match in that game. Newcastle are still an incredible team. With Trent, I think there's a similar situation here where he just has better fixtures. So this is the time I would be moving into Trent as opposed to Trippier. And if you can't move into these players, don't invest in them. I would probably spend the money on the attacking players instead. As far as goalkeepers, the only thing to mention, of course, is the Kelleher news. The asterisk is that he's probably only going to serve us for, let's say, 3 fixtures right now as a conservative estimate, which is fantastic, right? Fulham, Sheffield, Crystal Palace, all really good fixtures versus really, really bad offenses as well. In the context, of course, Fulham being the Anfield fixture. I think they're the best attack when you see this sort of 3-team lineup here. So I think Kelleher, of course, is a huge step down from Alisson, and that's the issue, I think. I think that it's a risk in terms of, for example, when we go towards AFCON, we probably still want triple Liverpool, or even in the short term, we still want triple Liverpool. Do you want your triple Liverpool to, for example, include a keeper who's a little bit worse than Alisson, and probably quite a bit worse than Alisson, if I'm being entirely honest? I don't know. Maybe I think you can risk it if you don't want to go Darwin at all. But I think if I wanted to say the best triple up for Liverpool now, it feels like, of course, if money is not an object, then it's Trent, it's Salah, it's Darwin. But of course, some people on a Holland structure will probably be looking at something like Tsimikas plus Darwin plus Salah. And so it's quite tough. right now you have to sort of think about that. And no other changes really in cheat sheet other than Becker and Allison, of course, and Ederson falling. I think simply it comes down to the fact that when it comes to the double game week, I think I'll be investing into Flecken instead. When it comes to Allison, unfortunately, of course, the injury just means that, you know, you probably want to keep him on your team and assess what happens with Klopp, but he might even be a sell in the future. And that's pretty much what it comes down to with the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. An extremely long episode, but I think this needed to be done for me to reassess the entire landscape of FPL and hopefully break it down to you in a condensed way. Thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoy the video. Once again, if we can get 20,000 subscribers, that would be absolutely lovely. In terms of supporting the channel, I also have a memberships option that's completely optional as well, but I will be able to, for example, give advice on a one-to-one basis in FPL if you are seeking that. Other than that, thank you guys so much once again, and take care and see you. Goodbye.